The wind howled across the endless plains, carrying with it dust, secrets, and the faint scent of pine from far-off hills. Somewhere in the horizon, the sun was just rising, burning the sky in streaks of orange and gold, but its light barely reached the lonely trail that cut through the dry, cracked earth. Out there where silence had a voice of its own, two lives were about to collide, two lives that fate had quietly been weaving together long before either of them knew it. Welcome to Western Love Story, where every heartbeat echoes across the wild frontier and every choice can change a destiny. Before we dive into their journey, don't forget to like and subscribe to follow every twist of this story, because what's about to unfold will stay with you long after the sun sets on this plain. In the small town of Dustwood, where the buildings leaned against the wind like old men seeking comfort in each other, one man rode into town as though he were carrying the weight of the world in his leather saddlebags. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes as sharp and cold as the mountain streams in winter. His name was Colton Hayes, a man who had learned to trust no one but himself. Stories whispered in saloons and around campfires spoke of his skill with a revolver, of the scars on his hands that told of battles no one dared ask about. But beneath that hardened exterior, there was a silence that no one could break, a quiet grief he carried from a life he had left behind and could never fully forget. It's not far from Dustwood, beyond the hills where the land softened into fertile valleys. There was a woman whose presence seemed to defy the harshness of the frontier. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had survived storms most would have run from. Her name was Leora Kane. Everyone who had seen her said there was a light in her eyes, a stubborn spark that refused to die, even when life had tried to extinguish it. Leora's past was a patchwork of loss and resilience. She had learned that hope wasn't something you were given, it was something you had to fight for every single day. And fight she did against shadows that lingered longer than the sun and against memories that whispered like ghosts. The paths of Colton Hayes and Leora Kane had been parallel for too long, running alongside the currents of fate without ever meeting. But the wind had a way of bending roads, and the universe had its own rhythm. On a day when the sky was unusually heavy and the clouds hung like dark promises over the town of Dustwood, their destinies began to shift. Colton's horse stumbled near the old creek, just outside town, sending a spray of water and mud across the dry earth. That was when Leora, coming from the valley with a small bundle of herbs and supplies, appeared as if the wind had carried her there for a reason. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. Colton, who had spent years building walls around his heart, felt something he hadn't felt in decades, an unfamiliar stir of connection. Leora, who had learned to read people like open books, recognized a story behind those guarded eyes, a story of pain, resilience, and unspoken longing. Neither spoke immediately. They didn't need to. Sometimes in the stillness of the frontier, understanding came without words. The first conversation came later, in the fading light, by the flicker of a campfire. Colton's voice, usually rough and guarded, softened as he asked about the bundle she carried. Leora explained that it was a mix of herbs for healing, for both the body and the spirit. "The land teaches you patience," she said quietly, "and sometimes it teaches you mercy too." Colton listened, sensing that every word she spoke carried weight, that she had endured more than most, and yet refused to let bitterness define her. He wanted to tell her his own story, but the words clung to his throat, heavy with the memories of battles, betrayals, and a life of solitude. The night grew colder, and the fire crackled like whispered secrets. Dustwood slept uneasily, unaware that two lives were intertwining just beyond its borders. Somewhere deep in the shadows, eyes watched from the hills. Someone or something was aware of Colton Hayes and Leora Kane. There were forces at play. Old rivalries, debts left unpaid, and choices yet to be made that could pull them apart before they even had a chance to understand what was happening. The sense of tension was electric, as if the earth itself held its breath, warning them that fate was rarely kind. Leora's hand brushed against the small satchel she carried. Inside were not just herbs, but letters, memories, and whispers of a life she had almost lost. Each step she took toward Dustwood had been guided by the faint hope of change. The possibility that the silence she had carried might finally transform into something brighter. Colton, meanwhile, had felt a pull he couldn't explain, a tug on his soul that had nothing to do with the gun at his hip or the years of wandering the plains. Something about Leora Kane threatened to unravel the carefully constructed walls around his heart, and for the first time he didn't resist. By the time they reached the edge of town, the wind had shifted again, carrying with it dust from distant trails and the faint sounds of life waking in the small settlement. Horses neighed, doors creaked, and the occasional cough echoed from the main street. But all that noise seemed distant compared to the storm of emotion between Colton and Leora. Neither knew what the next day would bring. But both felt the undeniable sense that their meeting was not a coincidence, that their paths had been converging for years without their knowing. The first night in Dustwood was uneasy. Shadows moved in alleyways, and whispers in the saloon hinted at old grudges that hadn't been settled. Colton kept one hand on his revolver, not out of fear of Leora, but out of habit, a reflex honed over years of survival. Leora, for her part, kept her senses sharp, aware that in a land like this, danger often arrived disguised as ordinary life. And yet, in the quiet moments between caution and awareness, there was a strange comfort in knowing someone else had come into her life. Someone who understood, even without words, the weight of surviving a world that often seemed determined to crush hope. As the first light of dawn broke across the plains, painting the sky with colors that seemed almost unreal, a distant rumble reached their ears. It was faint at first, like a whisper of thunder, but it grew, echoing across the valleys and hills. Colton's hand went instinctively to the reins, his eyes scanning the horizon. Leora's gaze followed his, and for a moment the fear, the hope, the uncertainty merged into a single pulse of tension. Neither of them spoke. Neither needed to. They understood the unspoken truth. Whatever was coming, it would test them both, and the choices they made in the next hours could change the course of their lives forever. Western love story had always been about more than just the land. It was about hearts surviving the wilderness, about connections forged in silence and strengthened by hope. And here on the edge of Dustwood, two lives that had wandered alone for so long were poised to face a journey neither could yet fully see. Colton Hayes and Leora Kane were about to discover that sometimes the most profound bonds are formed not in certainty, but in the quiet spaces where fate leaves room for hope. The wind picked up again, carrying with it a sense of anticipation. Somewhere beyond the hills, someone or something was waiting. Colton tightened his grip on the reins, and Leora's hand hovered near her satchel. The horizon burned with the promise of trials, secrets, and revelations. And as the first rays of the sun glinted off the metal of a distant fence post, one truth became clear. Their journey was only beginning, and nothing would ever be the same. Colton Hayes didn't sleep that night. The wind outside whispered against the walls of the small inn, rattling the shutters and carrying a cold promise from the hills. He sat by the window, eyes fixed on the horizon, trying to piece together the fragments of a life that had grown stranger with every passing mile. Dustwood seemed peaceful enough at first glance, but he knew better. Towns like this always had stories hidden beneath their calm surface, stories of debts owed, of grudges left to fester, of secrets carried like heavy packs on weary shoulders. And Colton had learned to read those signs as clearly as a map. Meanwhile, Leora Kane moved quietly through the main street, her boots crunching against the dry earth. She paused by the old general store, her fingers brushing over the weathered wood of the doorframe. She remembered a time long ago when she had been forced to leave her own home. When fire and betrayal had taken more than just walls and possessions, they had tried to take her spirit. But she had survived, and in that survival she had learned a truth that few understood. Hope wasn't just a feeling, it was a decision. Every step she took now was guided by that decision, every risk she accepted a promise she made to herself. Colton's horse, a strong bay named Justice, shifted nervously in the stable. The animal sensed the tension in its rider, a tension born not from danger outside but from the restless currents of fate that had brought him here. Colton had spent years trusting only the land and the law of the gun. People were unpredictable, hearts even more so. Yet, something about Leora Kane unsettled his certainty. She wasn't just a stranger passing through. There was an air of inevitability about her, as though the winds themselves had carried her to him. In Dustwood, the townsfolk whispered in corners. Some spoke of Colton Hayes with cautious respect, remembering the stories of a man who had once been a legend in distant territories, a man who could face down outlaws and live to tell the tale. Others spoke of Leora Kane in hushed tones, curious about the woman who moved like a shadow and yet carried the light of her own fire. No one knew exactly what brought her to Dustwood, and perhaps it was better that way. Mystery had a way of protecting people, just as easily as it exposed them. Back at the inn, Colton traced a finger over the scar along his forearm, a mark from a fight years ago that had ended a chapter of his life he preferred to forget. That chapter had been filled with betrayal, a trusted partner who had turned on him, leaving him alone with nothing but the dust of burned towns and the echo of gunshots. Every memory came unbidden, and yet he could not turn away. He had learned that the past was not easily escaped, that it lingered like a shadow behind every choice. And now, in Dustwood, that shadow felt closer than ever. Leora, meanwhile, had made her way to the edge of town, where the hills rose steep and foreboding. She knelt by a small stream, washing her hands in the cold water, letting the quiet soothe the tension she carried deep in her chest. The stream reminded her of a childhood long buried, of laughter that had once filled the air before loss had claimed it. She had learned early that the world could be cruel, that people could be broken by forces beyond their control, yet the very cruelty of life had taught her resilience. It had shown her that even in the darkest corners, hope could grow if one was willing to nurture it. As the sun climbed higher, Colton and Leora found themselves drawn into the rhythm of the town, observing its routines, noting its peculiarities. Dustwood was more than just a settlement. It was a crossroads of past and present, where histories collided and secrets hid behind polite smiles. Colton noticed the sheriff, a lean man with sharp eyes and a wary manner, watching him as though weighing the threat he posed. Leora noticed the old miller, who lingered too long at the corner of the street, glancing toward the hills as if expecting something or someone. Everywhere they looked, there were stories waiting to be uncovered, threads of fate ready to pull at them whether they wanted it or not. The day moved slowly, a tense calm that seemed ready to snap at any moment. Colton and Leora met again by the river that cut through the outskirts of town. Neither spoke immediately. Words felt heavy, inadequate for the weight of understanding they shared. But then, in quiet tones, they began to exchange fragments of their lives. Colton spoke of the lands he had roamed, of battles fought in silence, of the loneliness of a man whose heart had learned caution as a survival skill. Leora shared pieces of her own story, of a life shadowed by loss, of the determination that had carried her through trials most would have surrendered too long ago. In the background, the wind carried whispers from the hills, and justice pawed at the earth, sensing unease. Something or someone was moving. Shadows lengthened as the day waned, and both Colton and Leora felt it. That prickling awareness that the calm of Dustwood was temporary, that fate had a way of interrupting even the most carefully constructed lives. The sense of being watched was tangible, a pulse of tension that wrapped around them like a second skin. Colton's instincts, honed through years of survival, told him to be ready. Every sound, every shift in the light became a signal, a warning. Leora's awareness matched his, but hers came from a place of intuition and experience, not guns or scars.
Oh.
Together, they moved with caution, two forces drawn together by the silent strings of destiny, yet wary of what those strings might lead them into. As dusk fell over Dustwood, the town seemed to hold its breath. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and a distant howl carried across the plains. Colton and Leora found themselves near the old railway tracks that led to unknown territories too, stories that had been left unfinished for decades. They paused, staring down the rails as the last light of day painted everything in golden shadow. There was a sense here that history itself lingered, that past conflicts and hidden secrets waited patiently for the right moment to resurface. Leora reached for her satchel, checking the bundle of herbs, letters, and memories she carried. Colton adjusted the strap of his bag, the weight of his revolver and supplies grounding him. They both knew that what lay ahead would not be easy. The town, the hills, even the open plains seemed charged with tension, as if Dustwood itself were a living entity aware of their presence. They were no longer just visitors in someone else's story. They were now part of a narrative that had been unfolding long before they arrived, one that could change everything they believed about themselves, about fate, and about hope. Somewhere beyond the hills, in the shadows where the sun dared not reach, eyes glinted with intent. An old rivalry, a hidden enemy, or perhaps a force even more unpredictable was waiting. Neither Colton nor Leora could see it yet. but both felt it in the subtle changes the way the wind shifted. The sudden hush in the birdsong, the flicker of movement just beyond the edge of vision. Dustwood was a place where the past never truly stayed buried, and fate had a way of bringing truths to light when the timing was most unexpected. By nightfall, the town was quiet, yet heavy with unspoken anticipation. Colton and Leora found a place to rest near the river, the water reflecting the stars as though carrying secrets from the heavens to the earth. They shared no words at first, only a look that spoke volumes, acknowledgement of the path that had brought them together and the dangers they could sense waiting for them in the shadows. It was a quiet agreement, a bond formed in the brief time they had known each other, a promise that neither would face what was coming alone. And yet, even as they settled into that uneasy peace, the wind shifted again. A faint rumble echoed from the hills, subtle but insistent, carrying with it the feeling of approaching change. Something was moving toward Dustwood, something that would test every ounce of courage, every thread of hope, and every decision they had made up to this point. Colton tightened his grip on the edge of the blanket, and Leora's hand instinctively went to her satchel, fingers brushing over the letters that contained pieces of her life. Both knew without speaking that the coming hours would demand more than bravery. They would demand trust, and trust was a currency neither of them could afford lightly. As the stars shimmered overhead and the night deepened, Dustwood slept on the surface, unaware of the silent storm gathering just beyond its borders. Colton and Leora, bound by the invisible threads of fate, stared into the darkness, hearts steady but alert. The journey from silence to hope had begun, but the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. The first steps were often the hardest. In the stillness, one truth lingered, undeniable and electric. Two lives intertwined by fate could not be untangled, no matter how fierce the winds of destiny became. And yet, the question remained, what awaited them in the shadows of Dustwood, and would hope survive the trials that fate had already set in motion? The first light of dawn barely touched the hills when Colton Hayes rose from the riverbank, his body coiled with alertness. The night had been restless, filled with sounds too deliberate to be natural. Every rustle of the brush, every creak of a branch, carried the possibility of danger. He glanced toward Leora Kane, who still slept fitfully, her fingers curled around the satchel she kept close at all times. He didn't wake her. Some instincts weren't meant to be shared. Dustwood was waking slowly, a town with its own rhythm of caution and suspicion. By mid-morning, Colton had made his way into the main street, observing the people, reading the unspoken signals of townsfolk who had lived long enough to learn the value of discretion. The saloon doors swung open with a familiar creak, and inside, men of all ages and temperaments clustered in the corners, exchanging half-truths and lingering glances. Colton knew that beneath the surface of polite smiles, there were stories of debts, betrayals, and rivalries older than the town itself. He sensed a particular tension surrounding a man with a trimmed black beard and cold gray eyes shared in coal. Colton had heard the name whispered before he even arrived, a man whose reputation for quiet menace preceded him. Meanwhile, Leora Kane moved through the outskirts, her mind tracing the contours of Dustwood's landscape as if it held answers to questions she hadn't yet formed. She paused at the edge of the dry creek that split the town from the hills, listening to the faint hum of life, the far-off hammering of wood and the low rumble of hooves on dirt. Something was stirring beyond the hills. The wind carried more than dust, it carried intent, and she had learned to recognize the kind that could not be ignored. Back in the inn, Colton and Leora met again, this time under the pretense of sharing a meal. But conversation quickly shifted to the subject that neither could avoid, Dustwood itself. "Something isn't right," Colton said quietly, eyes scanning the street through the open window. "This town may look small and harmless, but I've been around enough to know that shadows hide where you least expect them." Leora nodded, her gaze following his, sharp and calculating. "I've seen enough trouble in my own life to know when it's coming. There's a storm in Dustwood, and it's not just the wind." The day wore on, revealing the subplots that threaded through the town. Colton discovered that Sheridan Cole was not just a man of influence, he was a broker of fear, someone who ensured loyalty through whispers and threats. Farmers spoke in hushed tones about disputes over land, some of which went back generations, others more recent and violent. Leora, meanwhile, learned that the town's healer, an elderly woman named Maeve Dunham, had been quietly trying to help both the desperate and the injured, often risking her own safety. Maeve had noticed Colton and Leora immediately, sensing the pull of destiny between them. She had seen strangers come and go in Dustwood, but something about these two lingered in her mind, as if fate itself had pressed them into her path. As evening fell, Colton and Leora moved toward the abandoned railway tracks again, drawn by a sense they could neither name nor deny. The rails stretched into shadow, disappearing into hills that seemed to hold more questions than answers. They walked slowly, every step deliberate, their senses attuned to the smallest shift. Colton's hand hovered near the revolver at his side, while Leora's fingers never left the satchel. The silence between them was heavy, but necessary, a shared understanding that words were often insufficient against the forces they faced. Suddenly, a horse's hooves thundered from the ridge above. Colton's hand went to the reins instinctively, his eyes narrowing. A rider appeared, cloaked in dust and mystery, the silhouette sharp against the dying light. It was a man neither had seen before, yet the aura of intent he carried suggested knowledge of the town's undercurrents. He slowed as he approached, and in the quiet tension, Colton and Leora could feel the pulse of an incoming storm. The rider spoke, his voice low, but carrying a weight of authority. "Colton Hayes," he said, eyes scanning him like a judge. "You've stirred something in this town that's been sleeping too long. Can you?" His gaze shifted to Leora. "You're part of it, whether you know it or not." The words cut through the air like a blade. Colton tensed, instinctively protective, while Leora's eyes narrowed. Questions surged, yet no answers came immediately. The stranger spurred his horse, disappearing as quickly as he had arrived, leaving nothing but a trail of dust and foreboding. The encounter left more questions than answers, and the night brought no relief. Colton and Leora returned to the inn, wary, their minds spinning through possibilities. Dustwood's ordinary calm had fractured, revealing hidden currents and dangerous underpinnings. Land disputes, old vendettas, hidden alliances seemed to converge around the town, and now around them. Leora wondered if her journey meant to heal and bring hope, might instead bring them into the heart of conflict too great to escape. Colton, meanwhile, weighed his instincts against the potential consequences. Every life he had touched, every enemy he had made, seemed suddenly relevant in ways he could not yet see. Meanwhile, Sheridan Cole's perspective revealed more layers to the unfolding tension. From the shadows of his office, he observed Colton Hayes with a mixture of suspicion and calculation. He had heard whispers about a man with skill and history, someone whose presence could unsettle the carefully balanced power in Dustwood. He noted the woman who traveled with him, recognizing her intelligence and potential to influence, to rally attention from allies and enemies alike. Cole's mind was always several steps ahead, anticipating moves, preparing for betrayal. He understood the stakes. This was not just about land or power, it was about controlling a narrative that had been decades in the making. By midnight, the town's pulse had shifted. Whispers became sharper, eyes more vigilant, and the quiet movements in alleyways carried purpose. Colton and Leora, now aware of the subtler threats, began to form a strategy of observation and understanding. They visited Maeve Dunham once more, learning about the secret tensions simmering beneath Dustwood's polite exterior. Maeve shared tales of old rivalries and recent disappearances, warning that the town had a history of consuming those who entered its orbit without caution. Every detail she offered deepened the sense of foreboding. The mystery was not just about a single threat, but about the web of danger connecting multiple lives, including their own. Even as alliances and motives became clearer, new conflicts emerged. Colton discovered that a group of outlaws, long thought defeated, were rumored to be regrouping in the hills beyond the town. Their leader, a man known only as Talon Graves, had been a ghost from Colton's past, someone whose vendettas were personal and violent. Leora, piecing together her own sources of information, learned that these outlaws were not acting in isolation. They had ties to Sheridan Cole, forming a network of power and menace that threatened Dustwood's fragile peace. The tension reached its first critical peak when Colton and Leora decided to scout the hills under the cover of darkness. They moved quietly, the wind carrying both the scent of dust and danger. Every shadow, every rustle of grass, felt amplified, each step forward weighted by uncertainty. Leora's instincts, sharp and unerring, guided them through the terrain, while Colton's experience with threat assessment kept them both grounded. The hills were alive with unseen eyes, every movement suggesting that the town's simmering conflicts had spread beyond the visible. As they reached a vantage point overlooking Dustwood, the full scale of the challenge became apparent. Fires in distant cabins flickered like warnings. Shadows moved too deliberately to be mere animals. And a single rider, silhouetted against the moonlight, circled the outskirts of town. Colton's hand rested on his revolver, every muscle taut. Leora, sensing the depth of the threat, clutched her satchel tightly, knowing that what they carried was more than herbs or letters. It was a link to survival, to hope, and perhaps even to the power to influence fate itself. The night grew heavier, and with it, the sense that Dustwood was a crucible in which destinies would be tested. Colton and Leora realized that the conflicts they faced were not isolated incidents but part of a larger story, one that intertwined lives, past grievances, and the fragile thread of hope they carried. They understood that the journey from silence to hope was not a simple path. It was a terrain riddled with peril, alliances that might fracture at any moment, and truths that could either strengthen or destroy the fragile bond forming between them. And yet, even in the heart of uncertainty, the connection between Colton Hayes and Leora Kane remained undeniable. The tension between past and future, danger and hope, created a fragile equilibrium. The night whispered warnings, the hills carried secrets, and the town of Dustwood seemed poised on the edge of revelation. Whatever came next would test them in ways neither could anticipate, and every choice would ripple across their intertwined lives. Fate had brought them together, but it would take courage, trust, and resilience to survive what lay ahead. The wind had changed by dawn, carrying a dry heat from the plains that made the air almost crackle. Colton Hayes stood atop a ridge overlooking Dustwood, his eyes scanning every shadow in the streets below. He could feel it in his bones. The storm of events that had been gathering since his arrival, the collision of past and present, was about to break. Beside him, Leora Kane adjusted her satchel, her expression taut but resolute. They both knew this was the point where waiting was no longer an option. The town seemed unnervingly quiet. Doors were shuttered, horses tied tightly, and even the usually boisterous saloon was still. Dustwood had a heartbeat of caution, and it beat faster when unseen eyes roamed its streets. Colton's instincts screamed that Sheridan Cole was orchestrating something, and Talon Graves, the outlaw from Colton's past, had to be involved. Their reputations alone were enough to unsettle a town, but combined, they were a force that could ignite the tinderbox of old feuds and hidden grudges. Leora leaned closer to Colton, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to move before they realize we're here. The tracks, the hills, everything. They're waiting for us to make the first mistake." Colton nodded, gripping the leather straps of his saddlebag tighter. They'd been patient, but patience only lasts so long. "We'll find the openings, Leora. Just stay sharp." As they descended the ridge, every step into Dustwood felt heavier than the last. Shadows clung to the corners of buildings, hiding figures who watched their every move. Colton's hand hovered over his revolver, ready to act, while Leora's sharp gaze caught subtle shifts: the flick of a curtain, shadow darting across a window, the faint creak of a door left slightly ajar. Dustwood had become a chessboard, and they were playing pieces in a game whose rules they had yet to fully understand. Maeve Dunham had warned them of the old mines outside the town, tunnels that had been abandoned for decades but were rumored to harbor more than just echoes of labor. She believed that whoever was stirring the unrest might be using them to conceal movements, to hide plans that would strike Dustwood without warning. Leora and Colton knew that investigating the mines would be dangerous, but necessary. The threads of fate had tied them to the town, and they could not ignore the signs. As they approached the entrance to the mines, the heat of the day pressed down on them, but neither spoke. Silence had become their ally, a shared language that carried more weight than words. Colton's experience with danger and Leora's intuition moved in harmony as they stepped into the shadows, the cool air of the tunnels swallowing them. Their footsteps echoed, the sound magnified, and Colton's hand rested near his revolver, ready to respond to anything. Deep inside, the tunnels were labyrinthine, twisting like the secrets of Dustwood itself. Strange markings on the walls caught Leora's attention: old symbols, perhaps warnings, perhaps remnants of those who had gone before. Her fingers traced the carvings, a quiet connection to the past. "These walls have seen more than we can imagine," she said softly. "Every story in Dustwood leaves its mark somewhere." Colton didn't answer, his senses alert. He knew the walls held more than history. They held the prelude to confrontation. A sudden shift in the shadows drew their attention. Two figures emerged, moving silently, eyes sharp and calculating. Talon Graves and a younger man, no more than 20, stood blocking the path deeper into the mine. Talon's reputation had reached them before, whispers of a merciless man who never missed, who thrived in chaos. Colton's jaw tightened and Leora's hand rested on the satchel, aware that everything they carried might be the difference between survival and failure. "You shouldn't be here," Talon said, his voice a low growl. "This town isn't big enough for the trouble you're bringing." Colton's hand rested on the revolver, but didn't draw it. "We're not the trouble," he said evenly. "The trouble came long before we arrived, and it's still standing behind you." Leora's eyes met Talon's, steady and unwavering. "You can't hide the truth in shadows forever," she added. "Fate has a way of bringing secrets into the light." The tension was almost unbearable, the air thick with anticipation. Every muscle in Colton's body tensed, every instinct sharpened. Leora felt the electricity in the air, the pulse of danger that thrummed in their veins. They were at the edge, the precipice of events that would decide not just their survival, but the balance of Dustwood itself. Outside the tunnels, the town waited unknowingly, while forces converged around them like a predator circling its prey. Suddenly, the sound of hooves echoed from the main street above, sharp and deliberate. Colton and Leora exchanged a glance. Sheridan, Cole was moving. The timing could not have been worse. Or perhaps it was exactly what fate intended. Talon shifted, eyes narrowing, sensing the larger game beyond the tunnel walls. Colton's grip tightened, the weight of the revolver grounding him even as adrenaline surged. Leora's instincts told her that they had to make a choice. Stay in the shadows, or confront the inevitable head-on. The air grew heavier as distant voices carried through the mine, muffled but unmistakable. Colton and Leora realized the town's quiet had been a trap, a prelude to confrontation. Dustwood was no longer just a setting. It had become a stage for the collision of power, greed, and survival. The subplots they had uncovered, the land disputes, the old rivalries, the secret alliances, were all converging. Every detail Maeve Dunham had shared, every observation they had made in the saloon or the streets, now fed into the tension, creating a perfect storm of uncertainty and danger. Leora's hand tightened on the satchel, fingers brushing over the letters and herbs, a tangible reminder of why they were here. Not just survival, not just strategy, but hope. Hope that Dustwood could endure, that people could rise above fear and deceit, and that two lives intertwined by fate could alter the course of events. Colton sensed the same undercurrent. He had spent years wandering alone, fighting shadows from the past, and now every instinct told him that what was about to happen could redefine everything he believed about destiny, about loyalty, about the fragile bonds of trust. Outside, the first fires of confrontation began. Light flickered against the buildings as masked riders appeared on the horizon, silhouettes against the rising sun. Dustwood's streets, once still and watchful, became a chessboard of anticipation. Every door, every shutter, every shadow could hold an ally or an enemy. Colton and Leora moved through the tunnels, the knowledge of what awaited them both thrilling and terrifying. This was the point where survival would meet strategy, where courage would meet consequence. Then came a sound that made every nerve taut, the distant echo of a gunshot, sharp and sudden. It was a warning, a signal that the forces gathered around Dustwood were no longer content to wait. Colton's pulse surged. Leora's breath caught. Talon Graves and the young man shifted, readying themselves, the tension in the tunnel now mirrored by the tension outside. Dustwood itself seemed to hold its breath, the entire town caught in the quiet before the storm. The moments stretched, each second loaded with potential for danger. Colton and Leora understood that the coming confrontation would demand every ounce of strength, every piece of knowledge, every connection they had forged. The past, the present, and the uncertain future were converging, and no one could predict who would emerge intact, who would falter, or who would be swept away by forces beyond control. From the ridge, Colton glimpsed movement, in the hills the outline of horses, the glint of weapons catching the light. Sheridan Cole's plans were unfolding, and Talon Graves had clearly been given his part. The intricate web of Dustwood's conflicts was tightening, drawing Colton and Leora into its center with inescapable force. Leora felt a surge of determination, a spark of hope that clashed beautifully against the looming danger. She and Colton were not just reacting, they were becoming active players, shaping the outcome even as the stakes escalated. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, tense shadows across the town, the air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. The first confrontation was imminent, the threads of fate pulling taut. Every whisper, every glance, every secret held by Dustwood's inhabitants was now part of a larger story. Colton and Leora knew that the choices made in these moments could define the rest of their lives, and perhaps the lives of everyone in Dustwood. And as the wind swept across the plains, carrying dust, secrets, and the distant echoes of hooves and whispers, both of them understood a truth they had long suspected. The journey from silence to hope was about to reach its most dangerous, most exhilarating turning point. What awaited them was unknown, unpredictable, and terrifying, but it was the crucible in which courage, trust, and destiny would be tested like never before. Fate had set the stage, and the first act of the storm was about to erupt. The sun had climbed high over Dustwood, washing the town in a harsh, golden light that revealed every detail, every shadow, and every face turned toward the approaching storm. Colton Hayes and Leora Kane moved through the streets with deliberate purpose, their eyes sharp, hands steady, ready for whatever fate had decided to throw in their path. The distant rumble of hooves and the occasional clatter of weapons against saddles told them that Sheridan Cole's men and Talon Graves' outlaws were no longer content to remain hidden. The stage had been set, and now it was time for the story to unfold. Colton's thoughts were clear, focused. Every step he took reminded him of the past he could never fully escape, but also of the reason he had come to Dustwood, to protect, to confront, and perhaps to find a measure of redemption. Leora walked beside him, her presence steadying, her gaze unwavering. She had learned over the past days that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. Every lesson she had carried from her past, every hardship endured, now fed into her determination to see hope survive in this town. As they approached the main street, the tension became nearly unbearable. Dustwood's townsfolk had emerged cautiously from their homes, peeking around corners and doorframes. They had heard the rumors, the whispers of conflict, the talk of long-feared rivals returning. But they had also seen Colton Hayes and Leora Kane, and in them they recognized something rare, force of integrity, of hope, and of courage. The crowd's quiet observance added weight to the moment, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which path the conflict would take. From the ridge above, Talon Graves and his men advanced, their horses kicking up dust, faces set with determination and old grudges. Sheridan Cole followed, his calculated movements precise, every command measured to maintain control over the chaos he had orchestrated. The two forces converged on the town, the streets now a narrow channel for confrontation, tension thick enough to taste. Colton tightened his grip on the reins, while Leora adjusted her satchel, ready to use whatever means necessary to protect life and hope. The first exchange came sudden and sharp. A rider from Talon's group broke from formation, attempting to flank the center of town. Colton reacted instantly, moving to intercept, his revolver drawn but careful, precise. Leora followed, her instincts guiding her through the chaos, ensuring they could reach the people most vulnerable. Maeve Dunham had already begun signaling townsfolk to safety, showing the bravery and wisdom of someone who had long endured Dustwood's hidden threats. Every subplot, every minor character, came alive in those moments, the old miller signaling hidden passageways, the blacksmith guiding frightened children to safe areas, and even the stray farmers rising in quiet defiance to protect their homes. Sheridan Cole's voice rang out over the commotion, calm but commanding. "You think you can rewrite history?" he shouted. "You think you can challenge power that's been established for decades?" Colton responded, steady and unyielding. "Power built on fear doesn't last, Cole. It's time someone reminded you that hope, courage, and loyalty have more strength than lies and threats." The words carried far, not just as a challenge, but as a declaration, a statement of truth that reverberated through the dust-choked streets. The conflict intensified, but Colton and Leora worked as one, anticipating each move. Talon Graves, fierce and relentless, pushed harder, but Colton's experience and Leora's intuition made them nearly untouchable. They had learned to read each other's silent cues, the language of shared trust and understanding. And in the chaos, a moment arose, a pause where both sides hesitated, sensing the tide shifting. It was here that Dustwood itself seemed to join the fight, every resident holding fast, every whispered prayer and wish for safety and hope strengthening the resolve of those who fought to protect the town. Then, the final confrontation drew near. Talon Graves and Sheridan Cole found themselves exposed, their coordinated force faltering as Colton and Leora pressed forward with unwavering focus. Every plan Sheridan had counted on, every fear Talon had expected to exploit, unraveled in the presence of two lives intertwined by fate, acting in perfect synchrony. Leora's courage shone brightest when she guided townsfolk to safety, ensuring that the hope she carried would survive beyond this moment. Colton's precision, honed over years of struggle and survival, struck decisively, dismantling the threats that had haunted Dustwood for decades. The climax of the tension came when Talon and Sheridan faced Colton and Leora in the center of town. Dust settled in the streets, the sound of hooves faded, and all that remained was the human confrontation, the raw, electric clash of wills. Talon lunged forward, but Colton met him with steady resolve, disarming and neutralizing the threat without unnecessary harm. Leora moved swiftly, intercepting Sheridan, whose calm demeanor faltered as he realized his control had collapsed. She held nothing back, her words a mirror of the strength and hope she carried, revealing that power rooted in fear would always yield to courage guided by truth. Finally, after what felt like hours though it had been minutes, the dust settled. Talon Graves and Sheridan Cole, their plans thwarted and their forces dispersed, retreated beyond the hills. Colton and Leora stood in the center of Dustwood, breathing heavily but alive, the first rays of sunlight breaking across the town with a warmth that felt almost miraculous. Round them, townsfolk emerged cautiously, eyes wide with relief and awe, seeing that the nightmare threatening their home had passed. Maeve Dunham approached, her aged eyes glistening with gratitude and pride. "You brought hope back," she said softly. "What hasn't seen courage like this in decades? You've changed more than just the outcome. You've changed what this town believes is possible." Colton nodded, exhaustion and relief mingling in his expression. Leora smiled, small but luminous, feeling the weight of the past days lift ever so slightly. They had faced the storm together, survived it, and proven that even in the harshest landscapes, hope and courage could prevail. In the days that followed, Dustwood slowly began to return to its rhythm. Broken fences were repaired, burned-out barns rebuilt, and whispered grudges set aside in the presence of the larger story, one of survival, bravery, and the intertwined fate of two lives. Colton and Leora became not just heroes in legend but figures of inspiration, proof that even in a town shadowed by fear, change was possible. Maeve continued her work, now aided by townsfolk, inspired by the bravery of the pair, and even the old miller and blacksmith shared stories of how ordinary courage could overcome extraordinary odds. For Colton and Leora, the resolution brought more than peace. It brought understanding of each other, of themselves, and of the path that had brought them together. Colton learned that solitude, though protective, could not replace connection, and that sometimes survival meant allowing someone else to share the weight of the world. Leora realized that hope, though fragile, was most powerful when shared, that courage could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she had not anticipated. The horizon glowed in the late afternoon, golden light spilling across the plains as Colton and Leora stood on the ridge overlooking Dustwood one final time. The wind carried a softer song now, not one of warning, but of renewal, whispering of futures unwritten and opportunities yet to be claimed. Colton turned to Leora, eyes meeting hers with a depth of understanding that words could not convey. "We've survived the storm," he said quietly. "But it's not just about surviving, it's about living, together, with purpose." Leora's hand brushed against his, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had endured and the bond forged in adversity. Dustwood, once a town shadowed by secrecy and fear, now thrummed with a renewed energy, a collective heartbeat strengthened by courage and resilience. The conflicts that had once threatened to destroy it were resolved, not through violence alone, but through the quiet determination of those willing to face the darkness and bring light. Every subplot, the land disputes, the hidden rivalries, the fear of the unknown, found its closure in the courage of those who refused to surrender to despair. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, Colton and Leora knew their journey had changed them irrevocably. Fate had intertwined their lives, leading them through silence and uncertainty, through danger and hope, to a place where resolution was possible and happiness within reach. Dustwood was no longer just a town, it was a testament to the power of resilience, the strength of trust, and the enduring light of hope. And as they rode toward the horizon, leaving behind the streets and shadows that had tested them so fiercely, the lessons of their journey remained clear. Courage could overcome fear. Hope could outlast despair, and lives intertwined by fate could create legacies far greater than they could imagine. Colton Hayes and Leora Kane had not just survived, they had transformed the world around them, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, the human spirit could triumph, and love and hope could flourish where silence once ruled. The plains stretched ahead, endless and bright, and for the first time in many days, the future seemed wide open, full of possibility and rich with promise. Their journey from silence to hope had reached its resolution, but the story of Colton Hayes, Leora Kane, and the town of Dustwood would linger, whispered in the wind, remembered in the hearts of those who had witnessed courage, and carried forward as a reminder that even the darkest times could give birth to light.